Welcome everyone to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Scott Montgomery to you today. Scott has an honorary professorship in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, and he's my colleague in the ESRC International Centre for Lifecourse Studies in Society and Health. Scott has a position as Professor of Clinical Epidemiology, which might make you think he only knows about the biology of poor health, but in fact he has expertise in the social side of ill health as well, which is why he's talking today about It's So Unfair, Stress in Adolescence. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Amanda. So I'm going to talk about stress in teenagers. Now, I live with a couple of them, and that's stressful enough, but that tells us that clearly it's stressful for them. So the question is, when does this stress go beyond the normal and become a problem for teenagers at the time, but more specifically, if it tracks over their lives and causes problems later on as they age? You know, a lot of people talk about stress causing diseases of different type. There are different forms of stress, but I'm talking about the psychosocial or the emotional sort of stress that people can feel. But does it cause psychiatric and physical disease? Now, some of the studies are contradictory. They don't all find that stressful exposures result in disease. And that's because to understand the relationship between stress and particularly physical disease, you have to take a life course approach. You have to look across people's lives, because it's an interplay of both exposure and susceptibility. What happens in your childhood can be important in determining your susceptibility to later stress. And then, of course, later exposures will play their role. But for diseases where we think stress is important, for instance, cardiovascular disease, we know that it's not exposure usually on a particular day. It's exposures accumulated over many, many years, causing damage to blood vessels, for example. So we need to look across life to understand why stress may be important for disease risk. Now, adolescence is an important time because we make that transition from being a child and those things that are formative to being an adult. And many of the characteristics that we develop in childhood, the things that happen to us then, shape us for the future. And so how someone is as a teenager is a barometer of what's going to happen in the future potentially in terms of susceptibility. Now, of course, a degree of teenage angst is completely normal. It is, as I say, a time of great change, which makes one anxious. But at what stage does difficulty coping with stress have consequences for future health? If somebody can't cope, and as an adolescent, they may have trouble coping with stress throughout life. So stress, why does it matter? Well, actually, stress is really important. Stress is something that is the reason we survive. You know, a bus coming, you're crossing a road, a bus is coming, it's a stress response that makes you get out of the way. So stress, although we talk about it in negative terms, is very important in a positive way. It's evolved over millions of years so that in a stressful situation, we're prepared to do something to save our lives, to catch prey, but to survive. Things like liberation of energy, so we have the energy to move more quickly. There are physiological alterations throughout the body to prepare us for that activity, and also preparation for injury. There may be inflammatory changes so that we're ready to deal with infection. Our blood thickens to a certain extent so that if we bleed, we clot faster, we don't lose too much blood. So this is an acute response designed for intense physical activity and potentially damage. Now, what's acute? Well, we have evolved so that we can deal with these things. Acute stress is something that perhaps lasts for minutes, possibly for hours, but not for longer, not for day after day after day or months. And chronic stress is what may have adverse health consequences. So while acute stress and the response associated with that means it will save our lives, Chronic stress is not what we have evolved to cope with. Some stress hormones at high levels, for example, are neurotoxic. They'll damage aspects of your central nervous system. If your blood is thickened, you have greater likelihood of clotting, then that can do damage to your blood vessels and increase your risk of ischemic heart disease, for example. So chronic stress isn't what we have evolved to cope with. And just before anyone points this out or writes in, I do know that humans and dinosaurs didn't coexist. It's an allegory. It's an allegory about sort of evolutionary processes. But what is stress? What is stress? And this is why some of the studies that have looked at stress and physical disease have contradictory results sometimes. Because what's stressful for one person may not be so for another. Not everyone, for example, likes jumping out of aeroplanes. Some people find going to the shops rather stressful. I certainly don't like clothes shopping, for example. So people have different tolerance to stress. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, really. This issue of stress resilience. How well people can cope with stress. Because if you cope with stress badly, every day is a stressful experience, much more so than for people who have a high tolerance to stress. And so this is the focus, this idea of stress resilience. And there are different components to this. There's perception, what one perceives as stressful, what one thinks may be a stressful event or exposure. And there's the physiological response to stress, what our body does in a stressful situation. And of course, these two aspects are tied together, the physical and the psychological. Now, in a stressful situation, once our stress response is activated, it affects just about every cell in our body. So there are receptors relevant to the stress response in just about every cell. So I'm just going to pick out one little part of the stress response just to illustrate this adaptation and why stressful experiences when you're young and inherited characteristics may have consequences with how you cope with stress later on. So in an evolutionary sense, if you're growing up in an environment which is very dangerous, if you have to go out and fight a velociraptor or something, then it makes sense to have a stress response that's very intense, that is of higher magnitude and tends to last for longer, to deal with this more stressful environment. And so there are negative feedback controls in the stress system physiologically, so that, for example, if you have high levels of stress hormone, there are receptors which identify that and they'll turn it down. Now, if you're adapted for a high stress environment, then there are fewer of those receptors, and so the stress response is down-regulated less quickly. And one player in that is the hippocampus in the central nervous system, named after its namesake, the hippocampus, because it looks rather similar, or the seahorse. So this is an interesting part of the regulatory process. So more receptors, these would be expressed in childhood. So if you have less stress in childhood, as you're developing, you express more receptors, and therefore you'll turn down the stress response more quickly because you're growing up in a less stressful environment, so you're less likely to need that flight or fight response. And the hippocampus is interesting. I picked this out because it's also involved in memory and cognitive function. So the two things can be tied together. We'll come back to this later, this idea of how the stress response and cognitive function are linked. But high levels of chronic stress can influence function of the hippocampus. And in fact, if somebody has a terribly stressful experience over an extended period, the hippocampal volume can actually reduce. So this idea of stress resilience, how can we measure it? Well, we started off thinking about this some years ago in a very simple way. Can stress in your childhood influence your development? And the answer is, of course it can, and there's any physical evidence of that. Well, in fact, you could just look at growth, at children's height. And the first study that looked at this was published in The Lancet back in 1951. This was Emily Widdowson's study of children growing up in German orphanages after the Second World War. And the study was designed to look at the effect of dietary supplementation. Children in orphanages were given extra bread and jam and orange juice to see if that helped them grow. And what they found was unexpected. They found that some children weren't growing as they should be, as they thought they would be. And the reason for this seemed to be they were in an orphanage where the matron was a rather nasty woman. And so, irrespective of whether the children had the supplementation, if they were in this woman's orphanage, they were growing more slowly. So this was one of the first studies showing that psychosocial stress can influence development as indicated by growth. We came back to this many years later using the National Child Development Study, a study of children born in 1958 and followed through their lives. And we saw something similar. Children from families whose parents either divorced or had arguments, serious arguments over an extended period, their height was also affected. So we have some evidence that stress in childhood influences development, rather crudely indicated by height. But we thought this may tell us something about a stressful environment and therefore stress susceptibility. So in another study of children who were growing up during the 1930s, followed into their old age in the 1990s, we looked at those who were growing more slowly, assuming that that was a marker of more stressful exposure, and found that indeed those who had a more stressful work environment were likely to have higher blood pressure. So it looked like there was an interplay between this measure of susceptibility, this marker of a stressful childhood, and then later exposures. But of course, this is very crude, looking at children's growth, because lots of things can influence this. So what could we use as a better measure? How can we measure stress susceptibility much more effectively? And so this took me to Sweden and the use of Swedish register data. Now, Sweden, many people say, is an epidemiologist's paradise, and that's because everyone has this personal identity number issued to all Swedish residents. And that allows one to use routinely collected administrative data for research, and that can span all of the major life domains. So you can know about conditions in childhood, you know about socioeconomic factors, you know about health service use and diagnoses. But rather critically for us, we had data from compulsory military conscription. And this involved a detailed assessment in late adolescence. So measures of many things, including a measure of stress resilience conducted in adolescence. And so this was what we were looking for as a marker of how people can cope with stress. And the good thing about the military conscription data is until relatively recently, it was very representative of the entire male population because it was compulsory to go to military service. Very few people were excluded. That's less been the case since about 2000, but for younger cohorts, it's very representative of the entire male population. So we constructed a cohort of all males born in Sweden between 1902 and 1956. This was around 245,000 who were assessed for military service. So they were born in the 50s. That means when they were teenagers, late adolescents, they would have had their military service assessment in the late 1960s or the early 1970s. And this was very complete in terms of this birth cohort. The exclusions were less than 3% for poor health or for people in prison, but the numbers are very small who were excluded. So this is very representative of males. Of course, unfortunately, it's only males, because at that time, women tended not to go for compulsory military service. So it is only males. So in that sense, it's not representative, but of the male population it is. There's very detailed information, objective information collected. Anthropometrics, height and weight, physical fitness objectively measured in a number of different ways, of physical strength as well. A detailed medical history and medical assessment is conducted. There are tests of cognitive function, written tests to see how well, you could call it IQ, but how well people's cognitive function is, and it's graded. And there's the measure of stress resilience, which of course I'm going to say some more about. So these men born in the 50s had their assessment in the 60s and 70s, and then they were followed up over time using this linked register material up to 2010. So they're in their 50s by this stage. So we had linkage to causes of death, hospital diagnoses, and all prescribed medication that they'd had. So we have a fairly good picture of their health, and we also have information on background family characteristics, as well as socioeconomic circumstances and occupation and so on in their adult life. So this measure of stress resilience from adolescence. Of course, the military were concerned with thinking about how suitable they are for military service. How will they be in a battle? But despite this, it's useful in a more general sense for us. It was a semi-structured interview conducted by a psychologist, and it didn't ask the people who were being assessed about what would happen if they were being shot at. It was based about their experiences in daily life, how they coped with things, what their interests were. And so we have this measure of stress resilience. We divide it into three categories: low stress resilience for the people least able to cope with stress, and high for the ones who cope best. So about 20% are in the low stress resilience category. That's the one I'll focus on throughout this. So the questions we asked are, is this stress resilience associated with both short and longer term health risks, particularly the longer term? Is it important about accumulating risk over time associated with stress? So is stress resilience in adolescence important? So we start off looking at something that happens fairly early on, and that's suicide. Suicide, there is a peak during early adulthood. And we can see this is a smooth statistical treatment of suicide risk, but we can see that top little line, that is those with the lowest stress resilience. And so they are more likely, these men were more likely to commit suicide if they had lower stress resilience. So in terms of a statistical treatment, a hazard ratio is 3.31, which means a 231% risk increase for suicide associated with low stress resilience compared with high stress resilience. Now, as I say, suicide is something that tends to happen, or more likely to happen, in early adulthood. So we can see this more contemporaneous effect, but is stress resilience a persistent characteristic that tracks further out into adulthood? So for this, we looked at anxiety and depression in middle age. And to identify it, we used pharmaceutical treatment, people who have been prescribed treatment either for anxiety or depression between ages 49 and 58. So this is more than 30 years later in most people. So is there an association? So low stress resilience compared with high, we see for anxiety, which is more relevant to stress, you can see there's 133% increased risk in those with low stress resilience when they were adolescents. For depression, a 48% increased risk. So we can see there is this evidence of tracking across life. It is something relevant to disease later on, psychiatric disease. Another interesting thing, remember I was talking about how stress and cognitive function may have a sort of rather intimate association with each other. Better cognitive function, we know, is associated with a reduced risk of anxiety and depression. But what was interesting is, we saw this here, but more than that, when we looked at the combination, even those with high cognitive function, high scores in those tests, if they had low stress resilience, that benefit was lost. There was no protective effect against anxiety and depression. So it seems low stress resilience may damage cognitive function, but also can eliminate some of its benefits where it persists as well. So low stress resilience in adolescence, it is a persistent characteristic in many people. It's relevant to long-term risk of anxiety and depression. Now, is it therefore associated with long-term risk of physical diseases? Because it seems to be there's going to be this potential to accumulate risk over time. So why should it be important? Well, in chronic stress arousal, if we have this persistent inflammation or pro-inflammatory tendency, we can have influences on microcirculation. You can see effects on barrier function in places like your gut. One becomes potentially more leaky, with, at least during acute stress. So what about peptic ulcers, stomach ulcers? Before the discovery of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori, stress was thought to be the most likely cause of peptic ulcer disease, or one of them at least. But H. pylori is a fairly common exposure. Most people are exposed to it. So there are other factors that may influence whether we have peptic ulcer disease or not. So is stress resilience relevant to peptic ulcer disease? So we excluded those with any gastrointestinal disease in adolescence and had a look at this. And so what do we see? So compared with those who had high stress resilience, the ones able to cope with it most, we can see an increased risk in the other categories, particularly those with low stress resilience, 128% increased risk of peptic ulcer disease for those with low stress resilience. So of course H. pylori infection is important, but it's that plus the influence of other factors. In this case, the role of stress resilience. Now this might be explained by several inflammatory and behavioral processes. People with low stress resilience are certainly more likely to smoke. Now at this time, these men, the vast majority, smoked as teenagers, but as it's the intensity and who gives up. But even beyond smoking, there are also these other inflammatory processes. It's not all explained by smoking, although that's one of the component mechanisms. So that's peptic ulcer disease. So what about more evidence of accumulated risks, things with a very long natural history for cerebrovascular and cardiovascular disease? So stroke and other types of heart disease. Exposures over many years we think are very important. So let's start with stroke. That's a major cause of disability. The incidence starts to increase more notably in middle age during the 50s. So is stress resilience in adolescence associated with stroke? And is that partly explained by an accumulation of risks that even begins in adolescence? So are those with low stress resilience already accumulating more risks for stroke as early as adolescence? So we see larger magnitude associations for hemorrhagic rather than ischemic stroke. That's where a blood vessel breaks. And the higher level for fatal and non-fatal stroke. So stress resilience is associated with them all. But if we look at fatal stroke, we can see if you have a low stress resilience, there's a 121% increase in risk. Now, if you look at childhood circumstances, this has a very small influence on this association. So the stress resilience seems to be very independent of what's happened, or those potential confounding factors, even though we believe it's influenced by childhood experiences. Is it explained by risk factors accumulated already by adolescence? At least it is in part. Those children or those adolescents with low stress resilience already have somewhat lower fitness, a higher BMI, and so you can see that many forms of risk are beginning to accumulate potentially associated with low stress resilience. But what is the association between, or the direction of association between physical fitness and stress resilience in adolescence? If you're not fit, does it make you less able to cope with stress? Or does that low stress resilience mean you're less likely to be physically fit? And so to do that, to look at that, we did a study on stress resilience and ischemic heart disease. So is the association of physical fitness in adolescence with subsequent heart disease altered by stress resilience? Does physical fitness behave in a different way in terms of relationship with heart disease if you have low stress resilience? Because if that was so, it would suggest that stress influences fitness rather than the other way around. So what do we see? Stress resilience and heart disease. We can see, once again, those with low stress resilience are at much greater risk of subsequent fatal and non-fatal coronary heart disease. The association is partly, but only partly, explained by pre-existing poor fitness in adolescence. But this is, I think, now what tells us about the direction of the association. We know that better physical fitness in adolescence protects against heart disease, and we see that very clearly in this study. Those with better physical fitness were less likely to have heart disease. But interestingly, if we looked at those who were very physically fit, but also had low stress resilience, that protective effect was lost. So you were fit in adolescence, low stress resilience, and you don't see the benefit of that fitness. Now that doesn't mean, as some of the newspapers reported, being fit isn't important. It is. I think what this tells us is, even if you're fit as a teenager, but have poor stress resilience, you're probably more likely to give up exercise earlier. You're not as likely to continue being physically fit. And this suggests, therefore, that it's actually the stress resilience that influences fitness rather than the other way around. So, what do we conclude from this? Well, behavior and metabolic risks are already more present in teenagers with low stress resilience. So they're starting to build risks already, even though they're only 18, 19, 20. The reduction in the benefit of physical fitness tells us that low stress resilience influences our lifestyle. We don't stay as fit. And also that there are multiple risks. We know that there are multiple risks associated with low stress resilience. So that may also act to work against the benefits of physical fitness. So low stress resilience means we start to build these risks consecutively from adolescence and onwards. So in conclusion, we can say that stress resilience in adolescence is something that matters. There are lifelong consequences potentially of having low stress resilience that begin early on, because childhood environment, we think, can influence development of stress resilience. Childhood is very important, so that's what we're going to work on next. The childhood exposures that influence development of resilience. But one thing we can say now, if we want to prevent disease in later life, you can't start too early. So promoting good health in adolescence might involve improving both physical fitness, but also at the same time, the ability to cope with stress. So some of my many collaborators and some of the papers that I've been using today, a lot of this work has been in collaboration with Örebro University in Sweden for the use of the Swedish register data. And this work is part of our work with ICLS, the International Center for Lifecourse Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. We've got time for a few questions, and there are people that come round with microphones, so if you could wait for them.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the methodology for how they evaluate stress resilience. So is it self-reported? Do they take observational data under particular tasks, or sort of what the methodology is for evaluating that figure?
Okay, so very briefly, it's a semi-structured interview with a psychologist, and it covers areas of experiences in daily life and how the conscripts cope with those experiences and their perceptions of them.
At the back and then here.
Thank you very much. I just wondered if you could elaborate on any methods of improving stress resilience, and whether throughout childhood and adolescence there is a particular sort of more plastic part of growing up. If it's better to, if there are any methods that we know how to do it in younger children, as we know with some of the other things with the plasticity of the brain.
Well, I'm going to give you a slightly disappointing and evasive answer to that, and that's what we're going to do next is look at the particular exposures and circumstances that are important for development of good stress resilience. That's a project we're just starting now. So I think until we know what the exposures that matter are, both in terms of good and low stress resilience, then it's hard to say what interventions are going to be most effective.
My question was the same.
Okay. So there's one here and one here. Perhaps we'll take that one first, yes, and then on to you.
To what extent do you think our diet can affect our stress?
Well, this is one of the sort of buzzwords at the moment, isn't it? Whether the microbiota are important in the stress response. And certainly there are changes in the microbiota associated with stress and coping with stress. So diet may in turn influence the bugs that are living in our gut, which is one of those, it's an organ which is involved in the stress response. So there is the potential for diet to influence how we cope with stress potentially, but further than that, I don't know.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering, at the Institute of Education, which is quite near here, they've done quite a few studies on male and female students and their different coping strategies, and found that they had different mechanisms, different strategies. I think one study found that the female students, when there were lots of deadlines for coursework or near exams, would tidy up, would clean their apartments, their dwellings, much more than men at times of stress. Have you noticed any such different coping strategies, say, between men and women, where there's an age differentiation, in terms of right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to talk to someone, or I'm going to do this. Is there any such distinction you found?
Well, unfortunately, this is one of the great limitations of the studies we've been doing. Because we were dependent on conscription, we could only look at men. So it's rather difficult to look at differences between men and women. But the studies we're doing now, we're just starting looking at what contributes to stress resilience. We're looking at women as well. So it's something we'd have to come back to.
Why does stress cause the gut to become more leaky, and how does that compare rate-wise with generally becoming more leaky with age?
Well, we don't know if it's particularly leakiness in the case of peptic ulcer disease, but at least in animal models, we can see that tight junctions become less tight under some circumstances during acute or chronic stress. There may also be influences on the microvasculature, so there may be less blood getting to certain areas.
Okay, well, I think we can thank Scott yet again for a very interesting